My name is Naomi Cole. I'm 30 years old, and for 26 of those years, my family called me the dumb one. Not as a joke. Not as an affectionate nickname you laugh about at Thanksgiving. They said it in front of teachers, in front of neighbors, in front of my own reflection until I started saying it about myself before anyone else could get the chance. My younger sister Vanessa got the piano lessons, the SAT tutors, the corner office with her name already engraved on the door before she'd earned a single dollar for the company. I got a pat on the head and a warning not to embarrass the family at dinner parties. Then, on the night of Vanessa's engagement party, in a ballroom filled with 300 of my parents' closest business associates, a woman I had never met walked up to my table, set down a leather folder, and asked if I would like to know what my grandmother had actually left me. Inside that folder was a cashier's check for $47 million. And that was only the beginning of what my grandmother had been quietly building behind my back for 6 years, waiting for the exact moment my parents would finally show everyone in that room who they really were. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the check wasn't the victory. The check was just the proof. The real story is about what it costs a person to be told, year after year, that they don't matter, and what happens when someone finally proves, with numbers nobody in that room could argue with, that they were wrong the whole time. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. If you've ever sat at a family table and felt invisible while someone else got the applause, type the word "seen" in the comments below. I want to know I'm not telling this story into an empty room. Now, let's go back to where it started, a house on the North Shore, a company called Colebrook Holdings, and a little girl who was told, over and over, that she wasn't built for greatness. The family. The Coles were the kind of family that got written up in regional business magazines every few years, always with the same photograph, my father Richard standing in front of the Colebrook Holdings building in a charcoal suit, my mother Elaine beside him in pearls, looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for old money that wasn't actually that old. My grandmother, Constance Cole, had built the company from a single warehouse distribution business in 1968 into a logistics and commercial real estate empire worth just under $200 million by the time I was in college. She was the one who mattered. Everyone else in the family, my father included, had simply inherited a seat at a table she built with her own hands. I was born in 1996, the older of 2 daughters. Vanessa came 3 years later, and from the moment she could talk, it was clear which of us my parents had decided was worth investing in. It wasn't cruelty at first. It was something quieter and more corrosive, a slow, steady sorting of 2 children into 2 categories. Vanessa was the bright one. I was a late bloomer, and then, as the years went on and the gap between us never closed the way they expected, I became simply the dumb one, said so often in our house that it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like my actual name. I struggled in school. Numbers rearranged themselves on the page for me in ways I didn't have a word for until I was much older, when a college counselor finally used the term dyscalculia and handed me a pamphlet like it was an apology 20 years too late. But as a kid, all I knew was that math homework took me 3 hours when it took Vanessa 30 minutes, that I brought home report cards that made my father go quiet in a way that was worse than yelling, and that at every dinner table, every school conference, every family gathering, there was a version of me being discussed in the third person, right in front of my own face, as though I were a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. My grandmother Constance was the only person in that house who ever looked at me like I was something other than a disappointment. But even she didn't step in the way I wish she had. Not at first. Not for a long time. The dinner table. I remember one Christmas in particular, the year I was 14. Vanessa had just won a regional math competition, and my father stood at the head of the table with a glass of wine in his hand, the way he always did when he had an announcement that made him feel important. "I want to say something about Vanessa," he said, and the table went quiet in that practiced, expectant way our family gatherings always did before praise was about to be dispensed. "This girl is going to run this company one day. Mark my words. She's got the mind for it." Applause. My aunt clapped. My uncle raised his glass. Vanessa did the thing she always did, ducking her head with a smile that was equal parts humble and rehearsed, because by then she'd had years of practice being praised and knew exactly how to receive it gracefully. Then my father's eyes moved down the table to me, and I watched the warmth drain out of his face the way it always did. "And Naomi's here too," he said. A small laugh rippled around the table, the kind of laugh people give when they don't know what else to do with an awkward silence. My mother didn't correct him. My mother, in fact, laughed along, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with her napkin like this was simply the natural order of things. Vanessa's success announced with fanfare, my existence noted almost as an afterthought, a courtesy extended to the daughter who happened to also be sitting at the table. I stared at my plate. I remember the exact texture of the mashed potatoes in front of me, because I was concentrating so hard on not crying that I needed something to look at that wasn't a human face. Under the table, my grandmother's hand found mine. She didn't say anything. She just held on, her grip firm and sure, and when I finally looked up at her, her eyes were fixed on my father with an expression I didn't understand yet but would come to recognize later as something close to contempt. She didn't say a word that night. But 3 months later, she asked me to come to her house alone, and she showed me something I didn't understand the significance of for 6 more years. Grandma's study. Constance Cole lived alone in a Georgian-style house 20 minutes from us, in a study lined with the kind of leather-bound ledgers that most people only see in movies about old banking families. Every other Sunday, while my parents assumed I was doing homework I could barely finish, I would take my bike to her house and sit across from her at a mahogany desk stacked with contracts, spreadsheets, and old photographs of the warehouse she'd started the company in. "You don't think in words the way your sister does," she told me once, when I was 15 and had just come from another parent-teacher conference that ended with my mother apologizing to a teacher on my behalf as though my existence were an inconvenience she had to manage. "You think in shapes. In connections. I've watched you do it since you were small. You don't remember facts, you remember how things fit together. That's not a smaller kind of mind, Naomi. It's a different one. And in this family, different has never been forgiven." I didn't fully understand what she meant back then. I only understood that she was the one adult in my life who spoke to me like I had a mind worth describing at all. She taught me to read contracts not word by word, which I could never do quickly, but as systems, as maps of who owed what to whom, and why. She taught me to look at a balance sheet the way you'd look at a family tree, tracing which branches were healthy and which were rotting from the inside. She never once made me feel slow in that study. She made me feel like I was being handed tools nobody else in my family had bothered to notice I needed. In the spring I turned 21, not long after she'd first been diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take her. She handed me a small leather box and told me to put it somewhere safe and not open it until I understood why. "You'll know when," she said. "And it won't be soon. It won't be pleasant, either. Your father is going to show you exactly who he is one day, in front of people who matter to him. When that happens, open the box." I took it home and put it at the back of my closet, the way you put away a coat for a season that feels impossibly far off. I didn't think about it again for a long time. 18 months later, my grandmother passed away in a hospice bed, and I was the only family member sitting beside her when she went. The job. I graduated from a state college in 2018 with an accounting degree. It had taken me an extra year and a mountain of tutoring to finish, while Vanessa, 3 years behind me, was already fielding acceptance letters from business schools that would have made our father's chest swell with pride before she'd even walked through their doors. I wanted, more than almost anything, to prove that I could still be part of the family business, that the years of being called slow hadn't erased whatever it was my grandmother had seen in me. My father agreed to hire me at Colebrook Holdings, but only as a junior records clerk in the back office, cataloging old property files and running errands for executives who never bothered to learn my last name even though it was also theirs. My starting salary was $38,000 a year. The same month I started, Vanessa, still finishing her MBA part-time, was brought on as a strategic associate reporting directly to my father, at a salary north of $150,000, with her own assistant and a standing invitation to every executive meeting in the building. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that if I worked quietly and well, eventually someone would notice. And in a strange way, someone did, just not the way I expected. Sitting in that back office for hours at a time, surrounded by decades of old contracts nobody else wanted to touch, I started doing exactly what my grandmother had taught me. I began mapping the company's history in my head, tracing who had signed what, which properties had been quietly sold off under strange terms, which relationships between the company and certain vendors didn't add up the way they should have. Nobody asked me to do this. I did it because it was the only part of the job that made me feel like the person my grandmother had believed I could be. For years passed this way. I watched Vanessa's title change 3 times while mine never changed once. And then, in the spring of this year, an email landed in my inbox with a subject line that read, "Position restructuring, confidential." The restructuring. I read the email standing at my desk, my coffee going cold beside me. It was 3 paragraphs of corporate language informing me that my role was being eliminated as part of ongoing organizational efficiencies, effective in 6 weeks, with HR reaching out shortly regarding severance. I read it twice, and then a third time, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less final, the way numbers sometimes did for me under stress. They didn't. That evening, I stayed late, ostensibly finishing a filing project nobody would ever look at again. Through the thin wall separating the records room from my father's office suite, I heard him on the phone with my mother. "We can't have her here once Vanessa's officially promoted," he was saying. "It looks strange, the founder's granddaughter running files while her sister's on the executive floor. People will start asking questions." A pause. Then my mother's voice, softer, almost gentle in the way that made it worse. "We've done everything we reasonably could for her, Richard. Some people just aren't built for this kind of work. We should let her find something more suited to her." I sat very still at my desk on the other side of that wall, my hand pressed flat against the drywall as though I could physically hold the conversation back. My salary at the time barely covered rent on a shared apartment with 2 roommates. If I lost this job, I had no cushion, no plan, nothing waiting for me. But it wasn't the fear of unemployment that settled into my chest that night. It was the recognition, cold and total, that if I accepted this quietly, I would spend the rest of my life being exactly what they'd always told me I was. Vanessa's engagement party was the following weekend. I remember thinking, with a strange, hollow kind of dread, that I had no idea what else my father might decide to announce. The party. The engagement party was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, the kind of room with crystal chandeliers and a string quartet tucked discreetly in the corner, 300 guests in designer clothing sipping champagne under warm gold lighting. My mother had picked out my dress for me weeks earlier, modest, dark, unremarkable, with the explicit instruction that I not try to compete with whatever Vanessa would be wearing, as though competing had ever once crossed my mind. I was seated at a table near the kitchen doors, 3 tables back from the head table where my parents sat with Vanessa and her fiancé, surrounded by cousins I barely recognized. From my seat I had a clear view of the small stage at the front of the room, and of a large framed photograph of Vanessa beaming in her graduation gown, propped beside a banner that read "Congratulations, Vanessa and James." At exactly 8:30, the music stopped, and my father took the stage with a champagne glass in hand, the same practiced warmth in his voice that I'd heard my whole life reserved for moments like this. "Tonight isn't just about an engagement," he said, once the applause for Vanessa had died down. "It's about the future of this family and this company. Effective this year, Vanessa will be named Executive Vice President of Colebrook Holdings, and in time, when I step back, she will lead this company into its next 50 years. The room erupted. Standing ovation. Camera flashes. My mother wiped a tear from her eye with the corner of a napkin, and Vanessa hugged our father on stage while 300 people clapped for a future that had never once included me. Not one person at that table glanced toward the back of the room where I sat, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching my own erasure happen in real time in front of everyone who mattered to my parents. It was in the middle of that applause that a woman I didn't recognize approached my table. She was perhaps 60, dressed simply but expensively, and she set a leather folder down in front of me with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. "Naomi Cole," she said. "My name is Diane Whitfield. I was your grandmother's attorney. She left something with very specific instructions about when it should be delivered to you." She glanced toward the stage, where my father was still accepting handshakes. "I believe that moment has just happened." The envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened the folder in the hallway outside the ballroom, away from the noise and the music, my back pressed against a cold marble wall. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me in the amount of $47 million, dated that same week, along with a sealed letter and a business card with a handwritten cell number on the back. "This is real?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's real," Diane said. "Your grandmother restructured a private trust 6 years ago, separate from her shares in Colebrook Holdings, specifically for you. The check represents the liquid portion of that trust, real estate holdings she sold off privately, investment accounts she never told your father existed. There's more, but that's for you to read in the letter, when you're ready." I stared at the number until it stopped looking like a number at all and started looking like something impossible, something that belonged in someone else's life. "Why now? Why tonight?" Diane's expression softened, just slightly. "Because your grandmother told me, very specifically, that this needed to be delivered on the night your father made it unmistakably clear who he had chosen, and who he hadn't. She said you'd know exactly what that meant when it happened." I'm sorry to say it appears she was right. I didn't go back into the ballroom that night. I called a car, went home, and sat on my bed with the leather box I hadn't opened in 9 years finally in my lap beside the check. When I finally broke the wax seal on my grandmother's letter, her handwriting, careful, slightly shaky near the end from her illness, filled 3 full pages. Grandma's letter. "My dearest Naomi," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then Diane has done exactly what I asked of her, and your father has done exactly what I feared he would. I am so sorry I could not shield you from this while I was alive. But I promise you, I have not left you unprotected now that I'm gone." She went on to explain what the box had held all along, not just the check, which represented 6 years of quiet, careful restructuring on her part, moving assets out of Colebrook Holdings and into an independent trust specifically so that my father would have no legal claim to contest it, but also a second, far more consequential document, a 12% ownership stake in Colebrook Holdings itself, held in a separate holding entity my father didn't know existed, along with voting rights attached to that stake that, combined with 2 other minority shareholders she had quietly cultivated relationships with over the years, would be enough to force an emergency vote on company leadership if I chose to use it. "I built relationships in that company for 50 years, Naomi," she wrote. "I know exactly who still owes me loyalty, and who has watched your father run this company into complacency while pretending progress. You do not have to use this power. But I wanted you to have it, because I have watched this family spend your entire life deciding you weren't worth investing in, and I refuse to let that be the last word. You are not slow. You were never slow. You were unsupported, and there is a difference the 2 of them never bothered to learn. Use this wisely, sweetheart. Not for revenge. For the truth." I read that letter 4 times that night, the same way I'd read the restructuring email 4 times the week before, except this time the words weren't rearranging themselves into something devastating. They were rearranging themselves into something I hadn't let myself imagine in 26 years, a future where I got to decide, for the first time, what my life was actually worth. Building the case. I didn't act that week. I sat with the letter, the check, and the documents Diane had given me for nearly 10 days before I called her back, because I needed to be certain I wasn't acting out of anger. My grandmother had built something careful and deliberate, and I owed it to her to use it just as carefully. Diane walked me through what she called the mechanics. The second document, the one my father had no idea existed, established that my grandmother's original 12% personal stake in Colebrook Holdings, which everyone in the family believed had been folded back into the general company shares upon her death, had in fact been transferred into an independent holding entity years earlier, entirely legally, entirely outside my father's knowledge or control. Combined with two other minority shareholders, old friends of my grandmother's who had never fully trusted my father's leadership, that stake represented just enough voting power to call for an emergency board review. One of those shareholders was a woman named Marjorie Halloway, who had been on Colebrook's board for over 30 years and had, according to Diane, been quietly frustrated with my father's leadership for at least a decade. I called her myself, my hands sweating through the entire conversation. "Constance told me about you 6 years ago," Marjorie said, once I'd explained who I was. "She said you were the only one in that family who actually understood the business the way she built it. I've been waiting to see if you'd ever call." "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. "That's fine," Marjorie said. "I do. Get me the documentation, and I'll help you request the meeting." 2 days later, a formal request for an emergency board session landed on my father's desk, co-signed by Marjorie Halloway, a second longtime shareholder named Peter Sue, and me. I found out later that my father read it standing in his office, and that the first thing he did was call Vanessa, demanding to know if she had any idea what I was planning. The confrontation. Vanessa called me that same evening, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. "What did you do?" she demanded, no greeting, no preamble. "I requested a board meeting," I said. "Same as anyone with standing can do." "You don't have standing, Naomi. You work in the records room." "Not anymore," I said quietly. "Ask Dad. He should be able to explain the rest." There was a long silence on the line, and then she hung up without saying goodbye. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, my father this time, his voice low and controlled in the way it always got right before it wasn't. "Whatever game you think you're playing," he said, "it ends now. You do not have the standing to call an emergency session of my board." "I think you'll find I do," I said. "Grandma made sure of that a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence I could hear something I had genuinely never heard from my father before, the faint, unmistakable sound of fear. "Your grandmother's estate was settled years ago," he said finally, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Then I guess we'll find out together at the meeting," I said, and hung up before he could respond. That night, for the first time since the restructuring email, I slept without dreading the next morning. My father had spent 26 years teaching me that being underestimated was a kind of prison. He was about to learn that it could also be a weapon nobody sees coming until it's already in the room. The boardroom. The Colebrook Holdings boardroom occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, all polished walnut and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. I arrived 20 minutes early in a borrowed navy blazer, carrying a folder of documents Diane had helped me assemble over the previous week, and found my father and Vanessa already standing near the entrance, flanked by two senior executives. "You shouldn't be here," my father said, before I'd even fully stepped off the elevator. "I have standing to be here," I said. "You can check with legal counsel if you'd like, but I imagine they've already confirmed it, which is why you're not stopping me at the door." Marjorie Halloway appeared in the boardroom doorway before my father could respond, her presence alone seeming to settle the tension in the hallway. "Let her in, Richard," she said simply, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that made it clear this wasn't a request. Inside, 11 board members took their seats around the long walnut table, my father at the head, Vanessa positioned beside him though she held no official board seat of her own. I was directed to a chair near the far end, and I noticed, on the wall behind the head of the table, a large portrait of my grandmother that had hung there for as long as I could remember, her painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with the same quiet attention she'd once given me across her study desk. The board chairman, a soft-spoken man named Everett Pham who had known my grandmother for decades, called the session to order and noted that it had been requested by 3 shareholders, myself included. "Ms. Cole," he said, turning to me, "you have the floor." I stood, my folder trembling slightly in my hands, though my voice, when it came out, was steadier than I expected. "Thank you," I said. "What I'm about to present may be surprising to some of you. I only ask that you review the documentation before drawing conclusions." Before I could continue, my father rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket with the same deliberate, theatrical slowness I remembered from every dinner table announcement of my childhood. "Everett, before we waste the board's time," he said, "I think it's only fair to provide some context. My daughter has struggled academically her whole life. She works in our records department. I love her, but she has no legal or financial background to be addressing matters like this." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa, beside him, added quietly, "She also has a learning disability, Everett. We've always tried to support her, but there are limits to what effort alone can overcome." I felt the old, familiar heat rise in my face, the specific humiliation of being discussed in the third person in a room full of people, a feeling I had spent my entire life absorbing without ever once being allowed to respond to it. But this time I didn't look at my plate. I looked directly at my father. "I won't be discussing my learning disability today," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected in the quiet room. "I'll be discussing this." I placed the trust documentation on the table, followed by the shareholder agreement establishing the independent holding entity, and finally, the notarized 2019 letter from my grandmother explicitly stating her reasons for the transfer. Everett Pham reviewed each page slowly, his eyebrows lifting further with every document. "This establishes an independent 12% stake," he said finally, looking up, "held outside company control, with full voting rights, transferred to Ms. Cole 6 years before your mother's passing." My father's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. My mother's estate was fully accounted for." "Her personal shares were," I said. "This was never part of her personal shares. It was structured as an independent trust specifically so it would never be subject to dispute during estate proceedings. She was very deliberate about that, Dad. I imagine because she anticipated exactly this reaction from you." The vote. The room was silent for a long moment before Marjorie Halloway spoke. "Combined with my own shares and Peter's," she said, nodding toward the older gentleman seated across the table, "Ms. Cole's stake gives the three of us sufficient voting weight to bring a formal motion before this board today, per Section 9.2 of our bylaws." "This is absurd," Vanessa said, though her voice had lost the sharp confidence it usually carried. "Even if this is legitimate, Naomi has no experience running anything. She can barely—" "I'm not proposing to run the company," I said, cutting her off, my voice steadier than I'd ever managed to be in this family before. "I'm proposing a vote of confidence in current leadership. That's all. If my father has this board's trust, he has nothing to worry about." Everett Pham looked around the table. "Is there a second for this motion?" "Seconded," Marjorie said without hesitation. The vote, when it came, was 6-5, with my father's own longtime allies unable to save him from what turned out to be years of quiet frustration among the board about his leadership, frustration Marjorie had apparently been documenting long before I ever walked into that room. Per company bylaws, a no-confidence vote of that margin required my father to submit his resignation within 30 days, with the board appointing an interim CEO while a formal search took place. My father didn't say a word. He stood, looked at me for what felt like the first time in my entire life, really looked at me, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, not rage, though I'd braced myself for that, but something closer to recognition. The understanding that he had spent 26 years underestimating the one person in the room who had, in the end, been paying closer attention than anyone. The aftermath. My mother called me 3 weeks later, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral ground, away from my father and away from the house I'd grown up feeling like a guest in. She looked older somehow, the careful composure she'd always worn like armor visibly cracked at the edges. "I don't know how to start this," she admitted, wrapping both hands around a cup of coffee she never touched. "Except to say that I'm sorry. For all of it. For every dinner where we let you sit there and disappear. For never once defending you." "You didn't just fail to defend me," I said. "You participated. There's a difference." She flinched, but didn't argue. "I know," she said. "I told myself we were protecting you from expectations you couldn't meet. But that was never true. It was easier for me to accept your father's version of things than to fight him on it. I chose comfort over you, and I don't know how to undo that. I didn't offer her forgiveness that day. I wasn't ready, and I didn't think pretending otherwise would help either of us. But I told her I was willing to try building something honest between us, even if it looked nothing like what either of us had once imagined a mother and daughter should be. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a start, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Vanessa reached out a month after that, asking if we could talk. We sat on a bench near the harbor, and she told me she'd started therapy the week after the board meeting, that being the golden child, as she put it, had never actually felt like the gift everyone assumed it was, that every achievement had simply become the baseline expectation for the next one, with no room left over for who she actually was underneath it. I knew how they treated you, she admitted. I told myself it wasn't my problem, because if I said anything, I'd become a target too. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth I never let myself say out loud until now. I didn't have a neat answer for her either. But I told her I wasn't interested in staying strangers who happened to share a last name, and that maybe, if we were both honest about the 26 years we'd spent on opposite sides of the same house, we could build something real instead of performing a relationship for other people's benefit. It wasn't the sisterhood either of us had wanted as children. But it was a beginning, built on something more honest than anything we'd had before. 6 months later, I moved into my own apartment that fall, a small place near the water with a view of the same harbor my grandmother used to walk along on her way to the original warehouse she'd started the company in back in 1968. I didn't take over as CEO, I never wanted that, and I told the board as much during the search process. Instead, I accepted a role as Director of Strategic Operations, a position I designed myself, focused on modernizing exactly the kind of overlooked back-office systems I'd spent 4 invisible years quietly mastering in the records room nobody else had bothered to notice. My father calls occasionally now, short, careful conversations about nothing in particular, the two of us circling around everything that happened without naming it directly. It's not close. But it's no longer silence, and for now, that's more than I ever expected to have. I hung a photograph of my grandmother on the wall of my new apartment, the same one that used to watch over the boardroom from behind the head of the table, and some evenings, when the light comes through the window just right, I think about the version of me who used to sit across from her in that study, certain that I was exactly as slow and unworthy as everyone kept telling me I was. I wish I could tell that version of myself what was coming. But I think, in a way, my grandmother already had. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood at 14, crying quietly over a plate of mashed potatoes while my family laughed at my expense. My grandmother didn't leave me $47 million and a stake in her company because I was smarter than my sister, or because I deserved it more. She left it to me because she knew I would never let power turn me into the kind of person who mistakes cruelty for strength, the kind of person my father had become long before I ever knew how to name it. My learning disability was never the flaw my parents made it out to be. It was simply the thing that taught me, earlier than most people ever have to learn, how to see what other people overlook. If you're watching this and some part of it feels familiar, if you've ever been the one at the table nobody applauded for, the one whose achievements got a smaller mention, or no mention at all, I want you to know something important. You don't need a hidden inheritance or a stranger with a leather folder to prove your worth. That's not really what this story is about, even though it might look that way on the surface. What I actually learned, sitting in that boardroom with my hands shaking and my whole family staring at me like I'd lost my mind, is that the version of yourself other people decide on at the dinner table doesn't have to be the version you carry with you for the rest of your life. My family spent 26 years building a story about who I was. It took one boardroom, one letter from a woman who actually paid attention to me, and one afternoon of finally believing I deserved to take up space, to prove that story had been wrong the entire time. You don't need $47 million to stop believing the worst thing anyone ever said about you. You just need to stop waiting for the people who said it to be the ones who take it back.